All right, guys, this is Matt Dean with A Plus College Ready, and today we're going to talk about feedback loops and how that negative and positive feedback loops help to regulate things inside your body. Before we get into our discussion of negative and positive feedback loops, there's some important terms you need to understand. One of those terms is homeostasis. Homeostasis is a property of an organism or a system that helps it to maintain its parameters, things like temperature, blood glucose levels, blood calcium levels, heart rate, blood pressure, and it helps to maintain those parameters within a normal range, a well-regulated, fairly constant range. Let's look at the definition of a negative feedback loop. A negative feedback loop in biology is when the product of some type of reaction leads to a decrease in that reaction. Negative feedback loops always bring a system closer to what we might call its set point range, its target, where it wants to be. A negative feedback loop's main job is to keep an organism at or near the set point range, to keep it in homeostasis. Negative feedback loops are about stabilization and maintenance of a steady, internal, stable environment. Examples in the human body include thermoregulation, regulating your body temperature and keeping it nearly constant. Maintenance of your blood glucose levels, again, keeping it those blood glucose levels, maybe not constant, but within some narrow set point range. We also regulate things like blood calcium levels. A positive feedback loop is a very different thing. A positive feedback loop occurs in nature when the product of a reaction leads to an increase in that reaction. Positive feedback loops are not about keeping a system in homeostasis. Positive feedback loops in the body are about making something big happen fast. It's about amplification. Examples in the body include making and releasing breast milk, the actual process of childbirth, the baby being pushed out of the uterus. Blood clotting is another example. It needs to happen in a big way, and it needs to happen fast. In plants, the process of fruit ripening is also stimulated by a positive feedback loop, and we'll talk about that one in just a minute. So let's first look at negative feedback loops. Here we see the analogy to a seesaw. And when the seesaw is balanced, that means the organism is in homeostasis. But let's say that first of all, there's some type of stimulus. Something upsets this balance. Something moves our seesaw. That sends out some type of message, some type of stimulus. That stimulus is picked up by a receptor or a sensor. That sends information to the body's control center, which is oftentimes an important part of your brain called the hypothalamus. It's oftentimes involved in homeostatic mechanisms. The hypothalamus will sense the change away from the set point, the change away from homeostasis, and it will send out some kind of message. Could be a nerve signal, could be a hormone, and that signal is going to go out to an effector, some type of structure in the body that can affect change, that can cause a change. That change will cause the seesaw to move back down. It will cause whatever is out of whack to move back into the set point range and get back to normal. Now, this is sort of a generalized version of negative feedback. The players involved are a stimulus, receptors, a control center, an effector, and a response. Now we're going to look at several real-world examples of how negative feedback loops work in your body. All right, so this diagram is showing us how a negative feedback loop functions in thermoregulation. Regulation of your body temperature. So let's say that you've been exercising, and the stimulus in this case is that your body temperature starts to go up because of that exercise. Well, there are receptors in your skin and also in the brain that sense that change in temperature, that rise in temperature. Those receptors send information to the control center, which again in this case is the hypothalamus. It sends information, signals, out to effectors. In this case, those effectors might be your sweat glands. And the message is being sent to those sweat glands basically says to create sweat, release it onto the surface of the skin so that the body temperature starts to drop due to the process of evaporative cooling. So the response is the evaporation of sweat and the drop in body temperature. And that puts your body back in balance. So that's if you get too hot. Now look at the opposite situation. So let's say that you're outside in really, really cold weather. The stimulus would be, it's cold. Your body temperature starts to drop. Again, the receptors in your skin and in your brain start to sense that change in body temperature, that drop in body temperature. Those receptors send information to the control center, the hypothalamus, in order to correct the drop in body temperature. It sends signals to effectors. In this case, those effectors might be your muscles, your skeletal muscles. And it tells those skeletal muscles to shiver, to vibrate, to produce friction, and that releases heat. So the response is the contractions of the muscles generate heat, raising your body temperature back up to balance, to within that narrow set point range of body temperature. So again, this is showing you that all the players are there. There are stimuli, there are receptors, there's a control center, there are effectors, and those effectors cause a response. And the response is always to move back toward homeostasis, back toward the narrow set point range. So that's a negative feedback loop and how it functions in thermoregulation. So now let's look at another example of a negative feedback loop in your body. Let's look at the feedback loop that helps to regulate blood glucose levels. So let's say that you just ate a very sweet meal. Maybe you drank a Mountain Dew and ate a candy bar. So the stimulus would be that your blood glucose levels start to rise. That's the stimulus. The receptors are located in the pancreas, and they sense that blood glucose levels are too high. Those messages are going to be sent to a control center in the hypothalamus. Eventually, that's going to signal the release of insulin into the blood. Insulin is a cell signal. It's a hormone. Hormones travel through the blood. This one travels through the blood and might end up communicating with the liver. It might also communicate with body cells, maybe fat cells. Insulin tells those cells essentially this. It tells them, hey, the blood glucose levels are too high. There's too much blood glucose out there. I need you to get rid of it. So the liver, the response of the liver to that signal is to take glucose out of the blood and store it as a large polysaccharide called glycogen. Body cells, muscle cells might also do that as well. So the liver and the body cells, maybe muscle cells, those are the effectors. And the response is that because glucose is being taken out of the blood and stored in another form, the response is that blood glucose declines. That's our response. And it declines and goes back toward that normal set point range, homeostasis. Now let's look at the other side. Let's say in this case, it's been a while since you ate. You've been fasting. So your blood glucose levels start to drop. That's the stimulus. The drop in blood glucose is going to be picked up by receptors in the pancreas. Information is going to be sent to control centers in the hypothalamus. And that's going to eventually trigger the pancreas to release a different hormone. In this case, an antagonistic hormone. A hormone with the opposite function of insulin. And that hormone is called glucagon. Don't confuse it with glycogen. This is glucagon. Glucagon, again, travels through the blood. And it will travel to places like the liver. The liver here is going to be an effector. Glucagon's message to the liver is this. Liver, you've been storing up glycogen. Our blood glucose levels are too low. We need you to break down that glycogen, that big polysaccharide, and release those monosaccharide pieces, the glucose molecules, back into the blood. So the response is that glucose is released back into the blood, causing the blood glucose levels to raise up and to once again approach the narrow set point range, go back toward homeostasis. So as we saw with thermoregulation, all the players are involved in this feedback loop. There's a stimulus. There are receptors located in the pancreas. There's a control center involved in the hypothalamus. There's a signal released by that control center, which goes out to the effectors, which then affect a response that always moves levels back toward the set point range, back toward homeostasis. We're going to look at one more quick example of a negative feedback loop in your body, and this is the loop that helps to regulate the amount of calcium ions in your blood. For example, there might be a stimulus in which your blood glucose or your blood calcium levels start to drop. That stimulus is going to be picked up by receptors in the parathyroid gland, which is in your throat, near your thyroid. It's going to be relayed to control centers in your hypothalamus. That's going to trigger the parathyroid gland to release a hormone into the blood called parathyroid hormone. That hormone is going to travel in the blood and eventually dock with receptors on cells in your bones called osteoclast. And the message to those bones is, those cells in the bone, is to break down some bone. Bone's made largely of calcium. There's also some phosphorus and proteins in there, but there's a lot of calcium. And the message is to the osteoclast is to break down bone, release calcium into the blood. So therefore, their response in this case is to raise calcium ion levels back up so that they approach this narrow set point range, the homeostatic range. The opposite can also be true. So let's say that blood calcium levels are rising. So that's a stimulus. That stimulus is picked up by receptors in the thyroid gland in this case, which is also in the throat area. The message is sent on to control centers in the hypothalamus. The thyroid is eventually stimulated to release a hormone called calcitonin. Calcitonin, like all hormones, travels through the blood, eventually binds to receptors on cells called osteoblasts. These cells are then stimulated to take the calcium out of the blood and to use it to make new bone, to deposit it in new bone. So the response is that since new bone is being built, calcium is being taken out of the blood calcium levels drop, and once again, they approach the narrow set point range or the homeostatic range. So again, we see all the players. We see a stimulus, we see receptors, a control center in the brain typically, we see effectors, which end up causing a response. And that response always moves levels back toward the set point range, back toward homeostasis. And again, that's negative feedback. Now we're going to talk about positive feedback loops. And remember, positive feedback loops are not about regulating the internal environment and keeping it stable. Positive feedback loops are about making something big happen fast. Let's look at an example of breastfeeding. The production and the release of breast milk is actually stimulated by the process of suckling by the baby. So the baby suckles. That's picked up by receptors, which end up affecting brain centers. That ultimately triggers the brain to release two important hormones. One of them is prolactin, which helps to cause milk production, and the other one is oxytocin, which helps to cause the release of the milk. So as the baby suckles, eventually some milk begins to be released. Well, that in turn probably stimulates the baby to suckle even more, which then causes the brain to release even more prolactin and even more oxytocin, which causes the release of even more milk, which causes the baby to suckle even more. So it's sort of like a snowball rolling down a hill. Starts out small, but as it goes down, it gets bigger and bigger and faster and bigger. That's a positive feedback loop. It's about making something big happen fast. So another example of a positive feedback loop in the body is the actual process of childbirth. When a baby's head pushes against the cervix, that sends nerve impulses to the brain. Once the nerve impulses reach the brain, they stimulate the pituitary gland to release oxytocin, a hormone. That hormone will travel through the bloodstream and eventually will bind to receptors on the uterus, causing it to begin to contract. Well, these contractions push the baby even harder into the cervix, and they cause that cervix to get more pressure on it, be stretched more. Well, this causes even more nerve impulses to be sent toward the brain, which causes an even bigger release of oxytocin, which causes the uterus to contract even harder, which pushes the baby harder into the cervix, which makes it stretch more, which again causes more nerve impulses, more release of oxytocin, and that process just keeps happening bigger and faster, until the baby is pushed out. And again, that's a positive feedback loop. It's about making something large happen fast. It's not about moving back toward homeostasis. Our final example of a positive feedback loop is fruit ripening. So let's say that an apple on a tree ripens. When that apple is in the process of ripening, it starts to give off a hormone called ethylene gas. Unlike animal hormones, which travel through the bloodstream, some plant hormones like ethylene gas can actually travel through the air. So this apple on the tree ripens, it releases ethylene gas, which binds to receptors on neighboring fruits, causing them to begin to ripen. Well, because they're ripening, they're releasing even more ethylene gas, which will affect even more apples, causing them to ripen faster, which will cause them to release even more ethylene gas, which will cause neighboring apples to ripen even faster. So again, this is about making something big happen fast. It's like a snowball rolling down a hill. Positive feedback loops have nothing to do with moving back toward homeostasis. They're about making something big happen fast. We talked about 3 examples: the process of making and releasing breast milk, the process of childbirth, and the process of fruits ripening like on an apple tree. Hope this helped.